Hello everyone, and welcome to my Bold and Beautiful Gossips 24 channel. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Rich Forrester never expected the moment to unfold the way it did. Not with the sun pouring through the glass walls of the Forrester living room, and not with Taylor Hayes standing in front of him wearing that hopeful, fragile smile that always managed to pull at his heart, because this time felt different, heavier, charged with a sense of finality that Rich had been trying to avoid for weeks, maybe months, and yet here they were. Taylor's voice steady but emotional as she spoke about history, about destiny, about how they had survived wars, betrayals, broken marriages, and near-death moments, how they had raised children together and buried dreams together, how love like theirs didn't just disappear but waited patiently for the right moment to come back home, and when she finally asked him, softly, almost reverently, to marry her again, to choose her not out of obligation or nostalgia but because she believed, truly believed, that they were meant to grow old together. Rich felt the room close in on him, his chest tightening as every instinct screamed that this was the moment everyone expected him to say yes, the moment Brooke wasn't in the room, the moment the universe seemed to hand him a second chance wrapped in Taylor's unwavering devotion. But instead of relief, Rich felt panic, because deep down he knew that saying yes would be a lie, not just to Taylor but to himself. And the silence that followed her proposal stretched so long it became unbearable. Taylor's eyes searching his face for reassurance that never came, Steffi's voice echoing in his head urging him to choose stability, to choose the woman who had always stood by him, while another voice, one he tried desperately to quiet, whispered Brooke's name like a curse and a prayer all at once. And when Rich finally spoke, his words landed like a bomb, calm but devastating, as he told Taylor he couldn't do it, that he couldn't marry her. That he wouldn't marry her. Not now, not ever again, and the shock rippled instantly through the room, through Taylor's face as it crumbled from hopeful certainty into disbelief, her lips trembling as she asked him what he meant, as if she had misheard, as if this rejection couldn't possibly be real, and Rich, in a move that stunned even himself, didn't soften the blow, didn't wrap it in excuses or half-promises, but told her the truth as plainly as he could, that marrying her would be wrong because his heart was divided, because he had spent years trying to convince himself that choosing Taylor was the safe, honorable decision while pretending that his feelings for Brooke were something he could finally bury, but he couldn't, and he wouldn't lie to her by standing at an altar with doubt still haunting him, because Taylor deserved more than a man who would always be looking over his shoulder wondering what if, and the pain in Taylor's eyes turned quickly into something sharper, more dangerous, as she accused him of leading her on, of giving her hope when he should have known better, reminding him of every sacrifice she made, every time she stepped aside only to come back when he called, every moment she believed he had finally chosen her. And Rich didn't deny it, didn't defend himself, admitting that he had been wrong, that he had wanted to believe he could give her what she wanted, what she deserved, but love didn't work that way, and the room seemed to tilt as Taylor's composure shattered, tears spilling as she asked him if this was about Brooke, if it always came back to Brooke. And Rich didn't answer immediately, which was answer enough, and when he finally nodded, barely, Taylor let out a broken laugh, the kind that comes from humiliation and heartbreak colliding, declaring that Brooke had ruined her life again, that no matter how far she ran or how hard she tried to build something solid, Brooke Logan always stood between her and the man she loved. And Rich, shaken but resolute, told her it wasn't Brooke's fault. This time that the blame rested squarely on him, that he couldn't keep pretending his feelings were something he could shut off like a switch, because no matter how many times he walked away from Brooke, some part of him never left her side, and that confession sent shockwaves beyond the room, because word traveled fast at Forrester Creations, and soon Steffi stormed in, fury blazing as she demanded to know how Rich could do this to Taylor, how he could break her mother's heart after everything she had endured, accusing him of being weak, of always choosing chaos over peace. And Rich stood there absorbing her anger, telling his daughter that he loved her mother, that he always would, but love alone wasn't enough to build a marriage if his heart wasn't fully committed. And Steffi's anger only intensified as she swore Brooke would never truly make him happy, that history proved it, that Brooke would betray him again. And when Rich didn't argue, didn't defend Brooke but simply said that maybe pain was the price he was willing to pay for honesty, the room fell silent again. Heavy with realization that this wasn't just another flip-flop, this wasn't Rich being torn in the moment, this was a line he was drawing at last. And Taylor, gathering what dignity she could, told him she refused to beg, that she would never again offer her heart to someone who couldn't give theirs fully in return. And as she walked out, every step echoed like a closing door on decades of shared history, leaving Ridge alone with the weight of his decision, because rejecting Taylor didn't bring relief, only a raw, aching clarity that he had finally chosen truth over comfort. And across town, Brooke felt it before she heard it, that familiar pull in her chest tightening as news reached her that Ridge had turned Taylor down, not for drama, not for manipulation, but because he couldn't deny what he felt anymore. And while Brooke didn't celebrate, didn't rush to his side, she understood the magnitude of what he had done, knowing this rejection wasn't about choosing her, not yet, but about Ridge finally refusing to live a lie. And as the fallout spread, through whispered conversations at Forrester, through Steffi's rage, through Taylor's shattered faith in destiny, one truth became impossible to ignore. Ridge Forrester had shocked everyone not by choosing one woman over another, but by choosing honesty at last, and in doing so, he set the stage for consequences no one could predict, because in the world of the bold and the beautiful, truth is never the end of the story. It's the beginning of the next storm. The aftermath of Ridge's rejection didn't settle quietly into reflection or private grief, because nothing in this family ever did, and by the time the sun dipped low over Los Angeles, the shock had already evolved into something far more volatile, a slow-burning emotional wildfire spreading through living rooms, offices, and hospital corridors as everyone tried to make sense of what Ridge Forrester had just done, because for the first time in decades he hadn't wavered. He hadn't left the door cracked open, he hadn't promised someday or we'll see. And that finality was what hurt the most, especially for Taylor, who found herself driving aimlessly through the city long after she should have been home, her hands gripping the steering wheel as tears blurred the streetlights into streaks of gold and white, her mind replaying the moment over and over, the way Ridge's eyes looked apologetic but unmovable, the way his voice didn't crack when he said he couldn't marry her, the way she suddenly realized that all the years she believed she was waiting for the right timing had actually been years of waiting for a man who was never fully hers, and that realization settled in her chest like a stone, heavy and humiliating, because Taylor Hayes was a psychiatrist, a woman who prided herself on emotional intelligence, on recognizing patterns, and yet she had fallen into the oldest trap of all, believing love could be earned through patience and loyalty, believing that if she stood still long enough, Ridge would finally stop orbiting Brooke and land firmly beside her. And now, with that illusion shattered, she pulled over, resting her forehead against the steering wheel as a sob escaped her, raw and unrestrained, because this pain wasn't just about rejection, it was about identity, about confronting the truth that maybe she had shaped too much of her life around a man who could never choose her without reservation. Back at the Forrester estate, Steffi paced like a caged animal, her fury refusing to cool, because every instinct in her screamed that this was another betrayal, another example of Ridge prioritizing his own conflicted heart over the woman who had loved him unconditionally. And when Thomas arrived, summoned by Steffi's urgent texts, he found his sister mid-rant, her voice sharp as she accused their father of repeating history yet again, of humiliating Taylor in the worst possible way. And Thomas, though quieter, carried his own storm beneath the surface, because he had seen the hope in his mother's eyes lately, had believed that maybe this time was different, that maybe Ridge had finally grown, and hearing Steffi recount the rejection felt like watching a fragile dream implode. And yet, as much as Thomas wanted to join in the anger, something held him back, a reluctant understanding that Ridge's honesty, brutal as it was, might have been less cruel than marrying Taylor while secretly yearning for someone else. And when Thomas voiced that thought, Steffi spun on him, incredulous, demanding how he could possibly defend their father after what he'd done. And Thomas didn't defend him, not fully, but admitted that watching Ridge waffle for years had done damage too, that maybe this clean break, painful as it was, prevented an even bigger heartbreak down the road. And Steffi, though unconvinced, fell silent, because deep down she feared Thomas might be right, and that fear, that their mother had been clinging to something that was never real, was almost harder to bear than anger. Meanwhile, Ridge sat alone in the dimly lit living room, nursing a glass of whiskey he barely tasted, the weight of his decision pressing down on him as memories flickered through his mind like a relentless montage. Taylor holding their newborn children, Taylor standing by his side after countless scandals, Taylor forgiving him when logic said she shouldn't, and with every memory came guilt, sharp and unforgiving, because rejecting Taylor didn't erase their history, didn't negate her sacrifices. And yet, even as that guilt gnawed at him, another truth surfaced with undeniable clarity. Marrying her would have been a betrayal far worse than this rejection, because it would have condemned them both to a life built on pretense, and Ridge exhaled slowly, acknowledging that for the first time in his life, he had chosen not the woman who felt safest or most familiar, but the truth that terrified him most, that his heart, flawed and stubborn, still belonged to Brooke Logan even after everything, even after all the pain, and that realization didn't bring joy, only a sobering sense of inevitability, because loving Brooke had never been easy, had never been peaceful, but it had always been honest. Across town, Brooke stood at her kitchen counter, staring at her phone long after the call ended, her emotions tangled and contradictory, because hearing that Ridge had rejected Taylor for the sake of honesty stirred something deep inside her, a mix of sadness for Taylor, guilt for her role in this endless triangle, and a cautious flicker of hope she refused to name, because Brooke had learned the hard way that hope could be dangerous, especially where Ridge was concerned, and as she replayed his words in her mind, words relayed through others not spoken directly to her, she recognized the difference this time, the absence of impulsiveness, the presence of restraint, and that restraint mattered, because it told her this wasn't Ridge running toward her in the heat of conflict, but Ridge standing still, finally acknowledging what he could and could not offer, and that restraint made her pause, made her question whether this was truly the beginning of something new or simply another chapter in a story that never seemed to end. The following day, the tension at Forrester Creations was palpable, whispered conversations trailing through hallways as employees speculated about Ridge's decision, some praising his honesty, others criticizing his timing, but all recognizing that this wasn't just a personal matter. It had ripple effects, because Ridge's emotional state always bled into his work, and when he arrived at the office, he found himself facing not only curious glances but also Carter Walton, who closed the door to Ridge's office with a measured seriousness, asking him point-blank if he was okay, and Ridge, after a long pause, admitted he wasn't, that rejecting Taylor felt like amputating a part of his life, but that it was necessary, and Carter, ever the voice of reason, told him that sometimes doing the right thing meant accepting short-term pain to avoid long-term damage, a sentiment Ridge nodded at, though it did little to dull the ache, because logic rarely soothed the heart. Later that afternoon, Taylor finally returned home, emotionally drained but resolute, and when Steffi rushed to her side, wrapping her in a fierce embrace, Taylor held her daughter tightly, drawing strength from the familiar comfort, and though Steffi launched into angry reassurances that Ridge was a fool, that Taylor deserved better, Taylor surprised her by gently silencing her, her voice calm but weary as she admitted that maybe this ending, painful as it was, freed her from a cycle she had been trapped in for too long, and Steffi stared at her mother stunned, because this wasn't the Taylor who waited patiently in the wings, this was a woman confronting her own complicity in her heartbreak, and when Thomas joined them, Taylor looked at both her children and promised something that felt revolutionary, that she would no longer define her happiness by Ridge Forrester, that she would finally choose herself, and those words, though quietly spoken, marked a shift that neither Steffi nor Thomas fully grasped yet, but would soon feel in ways they never expected. Days passed, and the emotional shock began to crystallize into consequences, because Ridge's rejection didn't just wound Taylor, it destabilized alliances, forcing everyone to re-examine loyalties they thought were fixed, and when Brooke and Taylor unexpectedly crossed paths at the hospital, the air between them thickened with unspoken history, neither woman eager for confrontation but neither willing to retreat, and for a moment they stood there, two women bound by decades of rivalry and shared pain, and Taylor broke the silence first, not with accusation but with a weary honesty, telling Brooke that this time, she wasn't angry at her, that she finally understood this wasn't about Brooke winning or losing, but about Ridge never truly letting go, and Brooke, visibly shaken, admitted that she never wanted to hurt Taylor, that loving Ridge had cost her more than anyone realized, and though their conversation didn't end in friendship or forgiveness, it ended in something rarer, a mutual acknowledgement of reality, and as they parted ways, both women felt the weight of that exchange linger, heavy but strangely clarifying. Ridge, unaware of that encounter, continued navigating the fallout, facing Steffi's cold distance, Thomas's cautious neutrality, and Eric's quiet disappointment, because Eric Forrester, who had watched his son repeat the same patterns for decades, couldn't help but wonder if this decision truly marked growth or simply another turn in a familiar spiral, and when Eric finally confronted Ridge, asking him whether he was prepared to live with the consequences of his honesty, Ridge didn't hesitate. saying he was tired of half-truths, tired of hurting people by trying to be everything to everyone, and Eric, though skeptical, saw something different in his son's eyes. A steadiness that hadn't been there before, and while he didn't offer approval, he offered acceptance, reminding Ridge that being honest didn't absolve him of responsibility, but it did give him a chance to change. As weeks unfolded, Taylor's transformation became evident, subtle at first but undeniable, as she poured herself into her work, into her independence, into a version of herself unanchored from Ridge's orbit, and this shift unsettled Steffi, who struggled to reconcile her anger with her mother's newfound resolve, because if Taylor could let go, what did that mean for the family narrative Steffi had clung to for so long? And Thomas, observing quietly, began to question his own patterns, his own tendency to repeat destructive cycles in pursuit of love, seeing in his mother's awakening a mirror he couldn't ignore. And through it all, Ridge and Brooke remained apart, deliberately, cautiously, as if both understood that rushing toward each other would only undermine the fragile honesty Ridge had fought so hard to claim, and that distance, though painful, allowed something new to form, not a rekindled romance, but a mutual respect grounded in truth rather than impulse, and whether that restraint would hold or collapse under the weight of history remained uncertain, because in the world of the bold and the beautiful, change is never simple, growth is never linear, and love, no matter how honest, is always tested. In the end, Ridge's rejection of Taylor didn't resolve the triangle that had defined their lives for decades. It exposed it, stripped of illusion and denial, forcing each of them to confront who they were when the excuses fell away, and as the dust settled, one truth stood unshakable. Nothing would ever be the same again because this time, the shock wasn't just in what Ridge refused to do, but in the uncomfortable possibility that he had finally learned how to tell the truth, and that truth, once spoken, could never be taken back. The shockwaves from Ridge's decision didn't fade with time. They evolved, deepening into something more complicated, more unsettling, because while anger could burn itself out and heartbreak could eventually scar over, the kind of truth Ridge had spoken had a way of rearranging lives long after the words themselves stopped echoing, and nowhere was that more evident than in the quiet spaces where people were forced to sit alone with their thoughts, questioning the stories they had told themselves. For years, Taylor, for one, found that the silence in her home felt different now, no longer filled with anticipation or waiting, but with a strange, uneasy freedom that left her restless at night, staring at the ceiling as memories surfaced uninvited. Moments when Ridge had chosen her, moments when he hadn't, moments when she had convinced herself that patience was the same thing as security, and with each recollection came a dawning realization that she had spent decades negotiating with her own instincts, silencing the part of herself that sensed Ridge's heart was never fully hers, and that awareness hurt in a way no rejection ever could, because it meant she had ignored herself for far too long. At the same time, Steffi's anger, which had initially felt righteous and protective, began to twist into something heavier, something more personal, because watching her mother rebuild without Ridge forced Steffi to confront her own expectations of love, loyalty and endurance, expectations she had inherited without question, and when she looked at Finn, steady, devoted, unwavering, she wondered whether she had subconsciously feared that kind of simplicity, that maybe she had learned to equate love with struggle, passion with instability, and that fear made her lash out even more fiercely at Brooke, who she blamed not just for Taylor's pain, but for the legacy of emotional chaos Steffi was determined to break. And yet, as days passed and Brooke remained conspicuously absent from Ridge's side, refusing to capitalize on the situation, Steffi found her certainty eroding, replaced by a confusing mix of resentment and reluctant respect. Thomas, meanwhile, experienced a quieter reckoning, one that unfolded slowly as he immersed himself in work at Forrester Creations, sketching late into the night, channeling emotions he wasn't ready to articulate into designs that felt darker, more introspective, because watching his father choose honesty over appeasement struck a nerve, forcing Thomas to reflect on his own past manipulations, his own willingness to bend truth to secure love, and the realization that honesty, however painful, might actually be the only path forward unsettled him deeply, because it meant confronting guilt he had long buried under justifications, and when Hope noticed the change in him, the seriousness, the restraint, she sensed something shifting, something fragile but real, and that awareness reopened wounds neither of them had fully healed, creating a tension that lingered unspoken between them. Ridge, for his part, didn't find peace in the aftermath of his decision, despite what some assumed, because choosing truth didn't erase consequences, It simply stripped away the illusions that once softened them, and as he moved through his days, he felt the weight of every glance, every whispered conversation, every unspoken judgment, especially from Eric, whose quiet disappointment cut deeper than anger ever could, because Rich had spent his life chasing approval, first from his father, then from the women he loved, and now for the first time, he was learning how to live without it, a lesson that left him feeling exposed and unsteady, but also strangely grounded, as if he had finally stopped running. Brooke, watching all of this from a careful distance, struggled with emotions she barely trusted herself to name, because while a part of her felt vindicated by Ridge's honesty, proof that she hadn't imagined their connection, another part recoiled at the devastation left in its wake, and Brooke had lived long enough to know that being chosen didn't always feel like winning, especially when it came at someone else's expense, and so she resisted every impulse to reach out, to comfort, to reconnect, telling herself that if Ridge truly meant what he said, he would need to stand alone for a while, to learn who he was without using either her or Taylor as emotional anchors, and that restraint, though painful, was an act of self-respect she had learned the hard way. As weeks turned into months, the dynamics within the Forrester family continued to shift, subtly but unmistakably, because Ridge's refusal to return to familiar patterns forced everyone to adjust, and nowhere was that more evident than in his relationship with Steffi, which grew strained as she maintained her distance, her conversations clipped and formal, as if professionalism could shield her from disappointment, and Ridge, though hurt, respected her boundaries, recognizing that trust, once fractured, required patience to rebuild, and so he waited, resisting the urge to defend himself, understanding that explanations wouldn't heal wounds that words had created. Taylor's transformation, however, became the most surprising development of all, because instead of retreating into bitterness or despair, she began to expand, taking on new professional challenges, traveling, reconnecting with parts of herself that had lain dormant, and as she stepped into this new chapter, she attracted attention, not romantic at first, but professional admiration that reminded her of her own worth, independent of any relationship, and when an unexpected opportunity arose, one that would take her away from Los Angeles for an extended period, Taylor found herself standing at a crossroads, torn between familiarity and growth, and for the first time in her life, the decision wasn't about Ridge, and that realization felt both terrifying and exhilarating. The news of Taylor's potential departure rippled through the family, stirring mixed reactions, with Steffi struggling against the fear of abandonment and Thomas quietly encouraging his mother to pursue what fulfilled her, and Ridge, when he heard, felt a pang of regret he hadn't anticipated, not because he wanted Taylor back, but because he recognized the finality such a move represented, the closing of a chapter that had defined so much of his life, and when he finally spoke to her, their conversation was calm, respectful, and heartbreakingly honest, as Taylor thanked him, not for the rejection, but for the truth that had forced her to reclaim herself, and Ridge, moved beyond words, realized that sometimes love wasn't about holding on, but about letting go with grace. Meanwhile, Brooke faced her own reckoning because Ridge's growth challenged her to examine her patterns as well, her tendency to equate intensity with intimacy, conflict with connection, and as she navigated her own independence, she found strength in standing on her own, rediscovering confidence that wasn't tied to Ridge's choices, and when they eventually crossed paths again, their interaction was different, measured, sincere, devoid of the urgency that once defined them, and in that moment, both sensed the possibility of something healthier, something built not on rescue or rivalry, but on mutual understanding, though whether that possibility could withstand the weight of history remained uncertain. The younger generation watched all of this unfold with a mixture of fascination and caution, absorbing lessons they didn't fully articulate but instinctively understood, that love built on denial eventually collapses, that honesty can be both destructive and liberating, and that choosing oneself isn't selfish but necessary. And as they navigated their own relationships, these lessons lingered, shaping decisions in ways that would only become clear with time. In the end, Ridge's rejection of Taylor didn't just alter one relationship, it initiated a quiet revolution within the Forrester family, dismantling long-held assumptions about destiny, loyalty, and sacrifice. And as each person confronted the truths they had avoided, the familiar chaos of love triangles and dramatic confrontations gave way to something more complex, more realistic, and infinitely more fragile. Growth, and whether that growth would lead to healing or simply a different kind of heartbreak remained unknown, because in the world of the bold and the beautiful, Evolution never comes without cost, and the story, far from ending, was only beginning its most unpredictable chapter yet.